I've been sitting sort of stunned backstage listening to Ethan's talk and thinking about Stephanie and Jen's and trying to sort of summarize what's going on. And all I can think of is that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our current philosophy. There's just so much going on to think about for the future, and I can't help but I don't want to kind of go into that space of existential crisis about what is the web, but I kind of went there.
I'm going to be crying myself to sleep tonight, so.
No, this is all happy stuff. There's so much possibility. And in fact, Jen, when you talk about layout possibility in the web and how we're leaving things to the side that we could be doing, you talked a lot about really avant-garde sort of magazine layout and about how in the past we've said we're not print, we can't do that. But I also think there's been the past we've said we're not print, we shouldn't do that because we should have our own identity. Does the web look like something, or is it so cross-discipline, cross-metaphor that we'll be just absorbing other design philosophies into it?
I feel like you asked two questions. I do think the web is its own medium, and I think we do want to keep asking questions about what is the web and is it yet what we think it will be. And I mean, to me, that's a very important and a very deep question. The first thing I heard about layout, I mean, I feel like, I think there's one thing that we should all really start getting rid of when we think about web design layout, and that is all these layout frameworks.
Can you talk about why?
Yeah, I think I would love to do a real survey and find out how many front-end developers actually know how to do a traditional float-based layout, because I almost feel like these days most front-end developers don't know how to do a float-based layout. They know how to hook up 960 grid system, or they know how to hook up Bootstrap, or they know how to hook up what. It feels like the last several years we just sort of stopped, even in fixed width layouts, it feels like people aren't writing layouts by hand. They're using frameworks. They're using other third-party people's code. And I feel like trying to figure out how to take a website where you're totally using other people's codes and do this new stuff that you don't know how to like get their thing to work with this new idea you have. Yeah, I don't either. So get rid of their code, write your own code, and it's not that hard. It actually is not that hard. There's no more IE5. Like some of the problems that we had with Netscape 4 and IE5, and the reason that those frameworks got invented in the first place are gone. Like, we don't need them anymore. You can write traditional float-based layouts pretty easily, and then you can make small changes. In my own work, some of the things that I've found to be actually really profound are actually very small things that I've done in the layout. It hasn't, and they're more profound than I would have thought they were. So I feel like don't get completely overwhelmed and think, oh, I'll do that in 10 years. I don't have time right now. Like, I think there are ways in which we can slowly introduce some of the ideas I was talking about without having a total freak out.
And speaking of overwhelmed, one of the common themes between your three talks is about changes in constraints, and especially in Jen's and Stephanie's, about removal of constraints and the ability to do so much more. So Stephanie, with respect to your talk, there's so much possibility there, right? And so many options, and you explored a lot of options in a short time. But I'm reminded of recent talk I saw by our colleague Josh Clark, who talks about, in respect to the Internet of Things especially, how sometimes we tend to look and say, we have this technology, how can we use this technology? Instead of looking at, like, how can we make things more magical? Basically, what I'm curious about is, like, where do we start? How do we figure out what to do with the things we have?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question.
I'm just nailing it here.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you know, and one of the things that I struggled with as I was writing the talk was often the idea of, do we even need this, right? Do we need to do this? Are we okay with what we've got? Do we need to add an extra layer of tech to anything? Is it going to make things better, or is it just going to make things more complex and people aren't really, you know, more things for people to worry about, issues of
So what's coming first here, the technology or the need, right?
Yeah. And I think what's really challenging is that the technology happens anyways, right? I think it was at Beyond Talleyrand a while ago. I think it's Christian Heilmann who had a quote that he put up of, you know, well, we built it and then we figured out what we were going to do with it later. And he was asking, I know you probably remember that one, you know, who said that? And, you know, people had various suggestions. And it turns out it was about the atomic bomb, right? They built it because they could, and then they figured out what they were going to do with it, right? So, I mean, weird analogy, but the thing is, we build stuff. This is what we do, right? We invent stuff, we build it, we do stuff. And then we're like, okay, now what do we do with it? And So I think the challenge is that we're always going to keep making stuff and is really starting to zero in on when do we need to actually use it? What is it good for? It's figuring out the what is it good for maybe a little bit sooner rather than having those years of just churn of, trying too many things or everybody rushing to one thing. Like all of a sudden everyone's going to have a beacon and everyone's going to have, it's like, oh, okay, well maybe we stop and we say, okay, hold on, what do we want to do with this? Like, where is the value?
Right, and I think some of the boundaries that you guys are pushing causes me to question, like, where is the web? Where does it start and end? Ethan, you talked about being device agnostic and coming back to Jen's and coming back to Stephanie's thinking, what is the web and what does it look like? Like, how agnostic are we talking? Are there any design level baselines or touchstones that we really can rely on visually?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a lot of the client work that I do, there's a big challenge for organizations to stop, like I was saying, to look beyond the layout in front of them. That, when I worked on the Boston Globe a few years ago, a significant portion of their readership was still on BlackBerry 4 devices. And, that's a punishing browsing experience for anybody trying to, and sadly so. I mean, they're wonderful browsers, but if you give them more than a kilobyte or two of JavaScript, and I'm not kidding, they sort of run into the woods screaming. But they still want access to the content. So how can you design an experience that's going to be accessible to somebody and also talk about that with an organization that's still so focused on, design comps projected up on a wall? And that's why I think it's really transformational to actually, introduce prototyping in devices as early as possible in the responsive design process. And it helps break apart this idea that there's no one canonical layout that any user is going to see. And then, some of the next level stuff that Stephanie was talking about was pretty fantastic. So,
I'd like to start queuing up some questions from the audience if anyone has any. And while we do that, I was just thinking, coming back to some of the stuff you were showing with CSS shapes and some of the interesting bleed stuff and the VW, the VH stuff. How does that play back into responsive design processes in terms of complexity as you scale across different kinds of viewports and devices?
I think the answer is yes, even though that wasn't a yes or no question. It's funny, when Ethan was talking, you were saying this responsive design, this responsive design, and I just wanted to cross out the word responsive and just put web. I think if someone came to me and needed me to build a fixed width website at this point, it would take me a really long time to remember how to do it. Everything that I talked about today, I'm talking about the exact thing that you're talking about. The first thing you should figure out is the content source order. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to design a layout without figuring out the content source order first. I grab content, I mark it up in HTML, and then I start applying CSS to it and shaping it into something. And if I want to draw something or sketch something in another tool first, great. But it's going to be fluid and flexible and mushy, and it needs to morph. And not only does it need to morph because the browser window is going to be different sizes and shapes, but also because the content is going to be different lengths. And there's going to be different numbers of amounts of content at different points. And so I guess it's sort of a lame answer, but I'm always thinking about it in these sort of there's 4 or 5 dimensions to it. And yes, there is. Have fun.
So some of the perceived complexity in the newer designs is really an extension of the kind of process you're already using. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I rein complexity in by, it's good to be semantically marked up well, and it's good to have proper source order. And that's a huge constraint.
So those are touchstones, right?
And sometimes people are like, but I want to do this other layout, and I have to change the source. No, you can't change the source order to get that other layout. You don't get that layout. That layout's off limits to you right now.
Yes, impossible figure.
No, really. And so I use that constraint to rein in the other kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I think to badly appropriate Stephanie's quote, it's I think we've been bounding off a lot of the complexity of the web for so long, just being so focused on the desktop historically, and I think we're still kind of working our way toward a vocabulary for dealing with some of this stuff. So early days yet, maybe.
So we get some questions out in the audience? Anyone? Don't be shy. If no one's going to ask anything, I'll continue along that thought in terms of oh, we do have someone. Please. I'm just interested to see if, as we remove constraints, if that inspires or overwhelms us.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I feel like the constraints aren't getting removed, they're just getting moved.
I feel like the area inside of what we can do is getting bigger, though. Like our options are growing.
Yeah.
So this is a question for Stephanie. You mentioned Air Canada earlier, and I had an experience in Air Canada back in June where before a plane could take off, we were forced to watch 2 ads. And it's one of these things we're talking about with mobile right now with ad blocking software coming up. But if we're talking about the physical web, should we be discussing kind of what we shouldn't be doing? And if we can, what are some of the concerns or things you think we should not be doing to abuse people's new forms of web exploration?
Right. It's a really, really good question. In some ways, that's one of the reasons I did this talk. I mean, part of it, in some ways, I don't really know what we're going to do. I don't know if we really need this tech, but the thing is, it's coming, right? So one of the things that's been really neat about the Physical Web Project, the way Scott started it, is he wanted it to be of the web. He wanted it to respond to the values of the web, because there's been lots of initiatives over the years where, you can push content out to people, and as soon as you tell anyone in marketing they can push content out to people, they will push content out to people. So, and it's just, it's what we're going to do. So the web should be different. I really believe the web should be different. The web is a universal platform. It's for the benefit of humanity. Everyone can access it. We've got an open platform so that if, one browser turns out to be really rubbish, then somebody can use somebody else's. And ideally, I think we should extend that to what we do in the physical world. So again, this idea that, you walk around with this thing in your pocket, it's not, that these beacons aren't tracking you, because all they're doing is just flinging out these URLs. If you don't want to engage with them, you don't have to, right? So I think a lot of these principles is trying to figure out, as we have this physicality now, what are these barriers that we want to create? What's acceptable behavior? But the neat thing is, if some browsers or some discovery services choose to behave differently, also users can just go walk the other way, right? I mean, one example of a slide that I didn't have because I just had too much information as it already was, this is the idea that, the discovery services or the browsers could create this lens on the world. And you could say, today I want to see the Greenpeace lens on what I'm observing. I want to see the EFF lens, right? So you could take whatever values and brands and things you're interested in, or it could be something as trivial as the TripAdvisor lens, right? But in the ability for users to say, this is the lens of the world I want to see, and the browser is this great platform that allows you to do that. It is not about what other brands want to do with you, it's what, your experience, your way.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Got a question in the back?
Yeah, you mentioned at one point, Stephanie, that sometimes through putting this talk together, you're asking why we would even need some of these things. And I was at a talk at New Relic a couple weeks ago, and there was a company from San Francisco that's doing Internet of Things, and it's a pretty big deal down there, I guess. And the main benefit she explained was not maybe each individual thing, but the whole data aggregation of all this, and then being able to put it all together to see what might benefit our lives and all that stuff. But with that comes all this data management, and I was curious to know how you keep that out of the hands of either the government or worse, even corporations who can see and track our daily activities and try to manipulate, or, because it's going to happen if all these little beacons are tracking us, and even if we check it on our phone, that's going to be a marker. And I'm not super paranoid. I'm just curious, how you see that. Because somebody's going to have to control that data, and I'm just curious how that might work.
Us, right?
Yeah. I mean, as it currently stands, the way the technology is made, there is no tracking, with the physical web anyways. The whole point is just literally, it just sends these URLs out, and that's it. It doesn't know you're there, and so on.
It's kind of like clicking on a link.
It's kind of like, exactly, and that's exactly the principle behind it. It's, with the web, you get your search results. Okay, the browser knows you're there, the search engine knows you're there. But really, all those sites that you're seeing in that list, they have no idea you exist, that you're even interested in them until you click that link. Unfortunately, once you click it, you go to the website, then you get all the tracking.
Then you got your third-party tracking.
Get rid of, yeah, exactly. So in some ways, really, it's up to us to start shaping these discussions, because I think, there are a lot of people who do really very much want to grab this data and try to do stuff with it. And a lot of people think they can do really interesting stuff with it, and that we'll actually like the stuff they do. But it's turning into a bigger and bigger question, is do we want our data gathered? And as it stands, that's one of the, I think, is the huge benefits of the way.
Is there anyone who answers yes to that question, just out of curiosity?
Do they want their stuff, do they want their tracking? And
I think it's a question we really should be asking,
Yeah.
talking about tracking, not just with the beacons, but in general. I wonder sometimes why among developers and people who really understand this technology, Chrome is such a popular browser when it's tracking the hell out of us. Like
Right, sorry to get all tangential.
Right.
We have time for just one more brief question before we've got to wrap up, so.
Quick question on the mobile connection speeds, and I was just wondering, question for the group, is there a way to detect a connection speed for your visitor and serve content? Is it via JavaScript, like a hinting?
Right.
Because you do a Google search and there's a lot of techniques out there, so I just wanted to ask for the group. No, okay.
Not
So not like an
reliable.
analytics program
Yeah.
or a hinting or something?
There's nothing reliable.
That's a veil of tears.
Yeah, there's not.
I mean, oh, sorry.
No. I mean, I think that's really the answer. There is
Right.
nothing. There is nothing reliable.
It's a tragedy in 5 acts.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of it simply has to do. It's kind of like a JavaScript test as well, in the sense that you can detect that the thing is there. You can say, it does support, but you don't know how it supports it, right? So you can detect 3G, but is it good 3G? Is it bad 3G? Is it throttled 3G? You just
Will it
don't
be
know.
3G in 2 seconds?
Will it be 3G in 2 seconds? Will it keep fluctuating, right? So, I mean, in some ways, that's why you progressively enhance. That's why you build from the ground up, because
Right.
you just don't know. I mean,
No,
yeah.
absolutely. And there's some APIs that are trying to be standardized to pull bandwidth a little bit more effectively. But I mean, the challenges are is that that initial measurement may not be representative of the speed of the connection, 3 seconds later. And it's never going to be able to tell us, like, if that data connection is metered in some way. Like, if somebody only has 200 megabytes to spend in a given month, doesn't matter if they're connected to, a decent LTE connection. So I think it's like, that's why I really liked Jasenia's talk and Steve's talk. And like, there's this conversation about keeping our footprint as small as possible. And then, thinking about how that shapes the aesthetic of our work in general.
I kind of want this to go on forever, but I think I should probably wrap up. So thank you guys again. That was awesome.